Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So, sometimes it's best to leave things alone and not over-explain. And this very well might be one of those times. And yet, I'm going to elaborate on the title of this conference, especially my half of it, Unveiling the Mythos of Iran. Let me give you an anecdote to begin. The mythology program at Pacifica Graduate Institute was everything I could have wished for and more, but it didn't offer courses on Iranian mythology. This isn't something I'm bitter about because it is completely impossible for any academic myth program to include every single tradition that has ever existed. The absence of Nordic mythology, for example, was noteworthy, as was Mesoamerican. The problem, however, with the lack of Iranian myth specifically is that as a result of a little neglect here, a little counter-pressure in politics there, a sovereign mythological tradition becomes classified under the umbrella of Islamic tradition. Veil number 1. According to this classification system, Rumi is an Islamic poet. Attar is an Islamic poet. And Sohrawardi and Avicenna are Islamic philosophers. The 1001 Nights is a collection of stories from the Islamic world, and artwork related to the Book of Kings is all too frequently classified as Islamic art. There it is. There's Ferdowsi at the Museum of Islamic Art in Berlin. I'm not making a new observation by any means. Many have long been aware of this classification system, and many have pushed back against it, including some non-Iranian scholars like Henri Corbin, about whom we'll hear from 𝗕𝘂𝗵𝗵𝗵 a little later. In his essay, Sufism and Sophia, Corbin remarked that Iranian Sufism recognized in Zarathustra its oldest prophet. According to a hadith circulated among Iranian Sufis, the Temple of Fire is seen as a symbol of divine love. Zarathustra gave visible form to this love by erecting the altar of fire to it. The hadith presents the Prophet Muhammad himself as an admirer of Zarathustra and quotes him saying, "In Iran, Zarathustra was the prophet sent by the Lord of Love." Corbin adds, "When the armies of Iran conquered Iran, this mystery was veiled to the world and withdrew into the intimate secret of hearts." Veil number 2. In a book about Corbin titled The World Turned Inside Out, 𝗕𝗵𝗵 writes, Corbin understood Iran as a mediating world both geographically and metaphysically. It symbolized for him the mundus imaginalis and the freedom of the soul that this announces.
Iran and freedom of the soul, what a good idea. And the Lord of love, what a decent God. Proponents of classifying post-Islamic Iranian thought as Islamic make rational arguments for doing so. On the other side of the argument, the late eminent scholar Ehsan Yarshtater observed that there is a prevailing battle against all that is Iranian in Iran's history, literature, and the arts, and that this existential threat to the self-definition of it, and that this is an existential threat to the self-definition of Iranians. His solution was to organize a research library dedicated to Iran's history, literature, and the arts. This ultimately yielded his colossal encyclopedia Iranica. He said, "I had this ideal in mind, that there would be an encyclopedia which would respond to all possible legitimate questions about Iran and its history and its civilization. It now includes an admirable online database of scholarship on Iran containing over 8,900 entries by invited scholars, among whom I believe is Dr. Reza Khani. The great director 𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗵, who was incidentally a top-notch scholar of mythology, recently shared with me that if Iranian mythology is mired in obscurity, it is mainly due to ignorance about this subject. This is a liberating thought because it means that the situation can be corrected by learning. I strongly recommend his Semiotics of Iranian Myths lectures on the Stanford University YouTube channel. There he makes another liberating suggestion. He suggests, We don't have to romanticize Iranian mythology, which is certainly something Corbin tends to do. Henri was a romantic through and through, as am I, probably. In other words, we should not assume that looking into the Iranian mythological landscape will only discover love and freedom. We should look with truthful eyes, and I would say a modern and critical lens. Undoubtedly, some principles are deserving of criticism. And what good could ever come from denying that Iran has a shadow of its own? So far, Unveiling involves the removal of 3 veils, an improper classification system, in my opinion, the cloak of conquest, and the veil of ignorance. The removal of this last veil is in our hands. Speaking of constructive self-criticism, I'm aware of my ignorance. Those of us educated outside Iran and outside Iranian studies departments tend to know little about the Iranian tribe. 𝗕𝗁𝗍𝗔 What was that map that 𝗕𝗂𝗏 showed us? Who were they? Where did they come from and when? Whom did they discover when they arrived on the Iranian plateau? How far did they spread and with whom did they mingle? How did they conceive of the divine and the cosmos? Who were their gods? Do we know that Iran and India share a root mythology, that Iran and Europe share linguistic and cultural roots? Do we take into consideration that Kurd, Baluch, Afghan, Tajik, Osset, and others, while not being Persian, are yet Iranian? How did Persian become the common language of Iran? What other Iranian languages are there? Trust that each language comes with its own mythic language. The Iranian mythological landscape is huge. This brings us to panel 2, Further Reaches of Iranian Myth. This panel features 5 presentations, some of which will certainly take us into unfamiliar territory. Before the talks, 𝗵𝗵𝗨 will dance and take us out of our heads for a few minutes and into the further reaches of the heart. Her dance brings us to the 4th veil. Emergent myths are those forming right now, in real time. It is plain to see that many Iranians are returning to the old myths and applying them to modern life. This is how myths endure and evolve, by the way, not by being left alone and in their so-called pure state, but when we discover their truth anew, by restoring them, by recreating them. At demonstrations, people wave the flag of 𝗕𝗂𝗶𝗵, of which Omi spoke. The supreme leader is likened to 𝗕𝗂𝗃. Just today, as we gather around the campfire of Iranian myth, 𝗪𝗏 Farid and 𝗪𝗆 𝗀𝗏 are performing 7 tales of 𝗕𝗁𝗏 in Vancouver. Last month, we saw 𝗕𝗂𝗵𝗵𝗺's amazing 7 Labors of Liberty. 𝗕𝘂𝗁𝗵𝗺 is preparing Rostam is unaware of his son Sohrab's whereabouts, and 𝗪𝗁𝗄𝗏's The River includes a musical and philosophical interpretation of Rostam and Sohrab. This is just here, just now. We can be sure that there is more on its way. In Iran, Persepolis was the highest visited site this Nowruz, and it was standing room only around the tomb of 𝗕𝗵𝗄𝗏. And at the same time, a new mythic image is emerging, which isn't exactly sourced from ancient Iran. It's new, and yet it's the world's first recorded mythological image. The mythic image of the divine feminine, the earth as mother, the universe as mother, and as lover. She who has been sentenced to a long period of obscurity, not just in Iran, but the world over, covered over, silenced, abused, vilified, neglected, and declared the enemy of God, is casting off the shroud that has announced her death. For it is absurd to think that the mother of life can be killed. I believe this is the mythic image that 𝗵𝗵𝗃 encapsulates today in a dance accompanied by Shajarian song, Iran, that envisions Iran, the land of Iran, as our mother. Mother, maiden, child, Iran, grief, and the love that creates worlds commingle and bloom in one heart-expanding piece. Ms. Sayad, my sister, is an Iranian sacred dancer, choreographer, teacher, activist, and founder of Dance of Oneness. 𝗕𝗵𝗄𝗃 performs and teaches her award-winning work internationally, initiating people into the wisdom of their bodies. With a Master's of Fine Arts in Dance and Choreography from UCLA and a Master's in Chinese Medicine, she is dedicated to individual and collective healing through conscious dance and movement. 𝗕𝗵𝗄𝗃 dedicates this dance to all the mothers who have lost their children at the hands of the Islamic Republic by expressing the deceased children's deep abiding love for their mothers and for their homeland.
آواز خوانی در شبم سرچشمه خورشید تو یارا دیارا عشق تو سرچشمه امید تو ای صبح فروردین من ای تکیه‌گاه آخرین ای کهنه سرباز زمین جان جهان ایران زمین ای در رگانم خون وطن ای پرچمت ما را کفن دور از تو بادا اهرمن ایران من ایران من ایران من ایران من ای در رگانم خون وطن ای پرچمت ما را کفن دور از تو بادا اهرمن ایران من ایران من ایران من ایران من ای داغ دیده بازگو بلخ و سمرقندت چه شد صدها جفا ای مادرم دیدی و مهرت کم نشد از خون سربازان تو گلگون شده رویت وطن ای سرو سبز بی خزان ای مهر تو در جان و تن ای مادرم ایران زمین آغاز تو پایان تو بر دشت من باران تویی در چشم من تابان تویی ایران من ایران من آن مهر جاویدان تویی ای در رگانم خون وطن ای پرچمت ما را کفن دور از تو بادا اهرمن ایران من ایران من ایران من ایران من ای در رگانم خون وطن ای پرچمت ما را کفن دور از تو بادا اهرمن ایران من ایران من ایران من ایران من در ظلمت تاریک شب مرغ سحرخانه منی در حسرم آزاده ای تنها تو تنها تو تنها تو ایران منی اینجا صدای روشنت در آسمان پیچیده است گویی لبانت را خدا روز ازل بوسیده است ای مرغ حق در سینت با شور خود بی آواز خانه شب شکن بار دگر فریاد کن ظالم ظالم جور سیاد آشیانم داده بر باد ای خدا ای فلک ای طبیعت شام تاریک ما را سحر کن ای خدا ای فلک ای طبیعت شام تاریک ما را سحر کن ای مادرم ایران زمین آغاز تو پایان تو بر دشت من باران تو در چشم من تابان تویی ایران من آن مهر جاویدان تویی ای در رگانم خون وطن ای پرچمت ما را کفن دور از تو بادا اهرمن ایران من ایران من ایران من ایران من ای در رگانم خون وطن ای پرچمت ما را کفن دور از تو بادا اهرمن ایران من ایران من ایران من ایران من
Our first presentation in panel 2 is actually a co-presentation. Dr. William Lynn and Dr. John Colarusso. Dr. Lynn is founder of mythhouse.org. Hello, Will. He's a co-host of Myths, The Greatest Mysteries of Humanity, which is currently airing its 3rd season. Will served in numerous leadership positions for the Joseph Campbell Foundation, including Executive Director of the Joseph Campbell Writers' Room. And as the founding chair of the General Education Department at Hussein College in Los Angeles Center Studios, Dr. Lynn is one of the key creators of an innovative film and performing arts college that began ranking among the world's best in 2018. He is a story producer, consultant, host, scholar, educator, and entrepreneur who works with leading artists to craft transformational narratives. He holds a BA in philosophy and a PhD in world mythology with an emphasis in depth psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute, the only place apparently. I'm personally always awed by his tireless passion for bringing awareness to the field of mythology in general. He will be joined on Zoom. He is joined on Zoom. Hello, John. By the eminent scholar, Dr. John Colarusso. John Colarusso holds degrees from Cornell, Northwestern, and Harvard. At Harvard, he specialized in linguistics and focused on languages of the Caucasus Mountain regions. He has taught at McMaster University since 1976, a full professor in 2 departments, anthropology and linguistics and languages. He has published or edited 7 books and written over 100 articles. His book, The Tales of the Narts, is available at the PRS bookstore. Dr. Colarusso is a recognized authority on the Caucasus, on mythology, and on historical linguistics. I heard him speak at a myth salon a few years ago and bookmarked him as one who can illuminate an unknown region of the Iranian mythological landscape. Please welcome Dr. Colarusso's Dr. Lynn. In a talk titled The Iranian Seeds of Arthurian Legend.
Let's say this, that the Iranian world and its influences have stretched from Camelot in the United Kingdom, what's now the United Kingdom, to Persepolis in what is now Iran. And in between, to bridge them, is a set of folklore tales called Nart sagas or Nart tales. And I myself have translated and brought 2 volumes of this to the public. The Indo-Europeans, now we think this would be the ancestral language, mother language for many of the languages in Eurasia, including those of Iran, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, the Iranian branch. The Indo-Europeans apparently invented nomadism, and the fringes of this group wandered off and blended in with sedentary populations, say in Greece or in what is now France and so forth. The Indo-Iranians alone, among all these little daughters, as they're called, continued the way of life of the Indo-Europeans. The Indo-Europeans called themselves Aryones, Aryo, something like that, meaning simply person. And the name Iran, in fact, it directly continues the name. So not only was there nomadism a continuation, but their designation was a continuation. And they preserved this ethnonym more clearly than any other branch, any other daughter of the original mother language. Now, some of them went down into India, and the fate of that language, or the breaking up into a variety of dialects, was very different from what happened with the kindred group called Iranians. So typically we say Indo for that group, for it goes to India, and then Iranians for the ones that did not go into India. Okay. They went into what is today Persia or Iran, and otherwise they continued doing their nomadism from the west of Europe all the way over to China. We have names for various groups that we can sort of guess at what they might mean. Ossetians might be the stags. They are the As, after which Asia gets its name. They're descendants of the As. The Massakati, for example, would be the large group, the large clan. The Alans would be the Aryans. The Rooks the white Alans, the Rooks Alani, would be the Western Alans, and so forth. We have beautiful art left over from this civilization. So they were fairly wealthy. They had a lot of gold ornaments, one sort or another. But still, this was a guessing game, and it's still to some extent sort of a guessing game. But if you look at the Nart tales, and Nart, the Iranian word for hero, if you look at the Nart tales, we suddenly get a very vivid image of exactly what life was like and what the culture was like for these nomadic hordes. So the big thing we find is what is called a war band. Now, that's been debated in linguistic circles by Indo-Europeanists for generations. There's a major work on it by Chris Kershaw. But now we have absolutely, there it is. You can see it, you can tell what it's doing. It's a group of 100 warriors. They're all brothers, and we would say in anthropology, fictive or fictional brothers. And they are the issue of a fictional mother, the mother of 100. And she somehow supplies them with food. She advises them. She's the source of wisdom. And we have a whole bunch of young men under her care that form the war band. Now, the fact that it's a war band implies certain kinds of other possible cultural features. One would be a degree of egalitarianism, because they're all brothers. They're all supposed to be related. All right. So one might think of fair play, fairness, and whatnot. A manifestation of this is something that we could sort of see as chivalry. there are conflicts and with members of other war bands or demonic figures in the tales. And in effect, this is how would you put it? A kind of code of combat. So in effect, if one fighter is losing, he can call a timeout, and they will agree again on a place and time to meet and resume their fight. It's a very chivalric sort of image in some ways. There are some other odd features. The hero can, the preferred weapon is a lance. The hero can stick his lance into 9 layers of the earth, and only the true hero can do that. Another hero takes an anvil of the god of the forge, rips it out of the ground, and throws it, rips it out of 5 layers and throws it into 9 layers. And in one Ossetian tale, the hero actually goes looking for someone in the land of the dead and passes through 9 levels of hell, of the afterlife, in pursuit. So someone should tell Dante Alighieri with his 9 layers of hell that he was being influenced by Iranians. The warriors too had armor, chainmail, so they were. That was another manifestation of relative wealth, and they also armed their horses, covered their horses. So obviously they valued their horses. So they had armor and whatnot. Then there's also a series of banquets, and at the banquet there's a special barrel that contains a drink called 𝗪. And if a true hero gets up and tells the truth while his hand is on the barrel, the 𝗪 will bubble over, boil up and bubble over. So there's a kind of truth testing drink environment as well. So we can now talk in a certain degree of certitude about cultural features that were characteristic of the Iranians, Iranians nomads from Eastern Europe all the way across on the Silk Road into Western China. One other thing I should have mentioned, yes, there are tales of the hero dying and having his sword tossed into a lake. There's an Ossetian one, and of course the lake boils when it happens. But this is also a tale from the Uyghurs out in Xinjiang, and my colleague, Victor Mayer, who's an expert on Uyghurs, actually found this folk tale as well. So it seems to be a folk tale that stretched pretty well from one side of the Iranian world to the other. Now, the heritage we're talking about pretty much was scattered with the fall and collapse of the Roman Empire. These people had already come into the empire in many ways as mercenaries, fleeing turmoil in the Central Asian homeland or original land. And then the question is, to what extent can we recognize the influences of this group? And I would suggest that Dr. Lin will give us a very good presentation about some of the details and influences from Iranian culture that we, in effect, are in a position now to understand and to identify, and no longer matters of contentious debate.
Testing my mic. All right, great. So while she pulls this up, I'm going to mention the video clip I'm not going to play. And I'm also going to find the sweet spot on this stage that we're all looking for. This is a video clip from the movie King Arthur. Have any of you guys seen King Arthur with Clive Owen and Keira Knightley? Yeah, very cool. Yes, some of you may know that this opens with a memory of some scholarship, some new scholarship that has gone into the formation of that movie. That scholarship comes from this book, From Scythia to Camelot, by Scott Littleton and 𝗫𝗵𝗃. 𝗫𝗵𝗃 was a consultant on that film, and the introduction to that book is by our friend, John Colarusso, and this was based off of his, at the time, unpublished work on Ossetian Nart sagas. This is one of the reasons I reached out to him, is because I wanted access to that book before it was published. It's now published, and it's in the bookstore. That book gives us the Ossetian Nart sagas, and what's interesting about those is those are the ones that point us towards the Arthurian legends. So if you would like to see more about that, or if you want to see the film, it's a good night to go see King Arthur with Clive Owen and Keira Knightley. And it does that. It goes into this whole history of how the Arthurian tradition may or may not have been, and we're going to argue today, influenced by Indo-Iranian mythologies and peoples. So John mentioned that the Indo-Iranian language family is part of the Indo-European language family. And so today, my understanding, and first of all, let me stop and say, first I want to say that I'm like very honored to be here. I recognize that this is not just a conference on mythology. The last time I met with John, it was presented with John, I think it was in Edinburgh. At least it wasn't just an interview when we presented there. And it was not the same. There were a bunch of academics. It was meaningful to them for their own academic reasons, but I acknowledge and recognize that this material is not just meaningful to you as material you relate to, but the reason why this is happening today is because it's a meaningful moment to engage these myths. And I just want to acknowledge how important that is, how honored I am to be part of something that's bigger than that. And so what I want to do today is I want to show that there are a few different ways that we can track the participation of Indo-Iranian speaking people in Europe. First, historically, John mentioned many of these connections, and then mythologically. And I've only got 15 minutes, so I'm going to fly through it like, you know, it's going to be a punch in the face. Sorry. So first, let's look at the historical, then we'll look at the aesthetic impact, the look of Europe following Indo-Iranian influence, then a key set of myths, and then we're going to return to what he was saying about the egalitarian ethic. So first, as he mentioned, the core historical trauma. And first, recognize this, all the biggest myths ever, the Iliad, the Odyssey, etc., Marvel, they're inspired by some kind of heavy cultural trauma. Heavy cultural trauma is going to lead to a story that big, cared about by that many people. There was the whole world collapse. The Bronze Age collapse in 1200 BC is what inspired the Iliad, the Odyssey. It's that trauma. Well, the trauma that inspired Arthurian legend, the big trauma, is the fall of the Roman Empire. Before Rome fell, they pulled out of Britannia, the Roman part of England. And when they did, there was a great power vacuum. But before we get there, as John mentioned, there's this historical entry or introduction of Alans, Ossetians, Sarmatians, Scythians. These are Indo-Iranian speaking people, especially from north of the Black Sea and the North Caucasus areas. So what you see in that film clip is there was a war with the Romans. After the Romans gained control or influence over these people, they began integrating them into their militaries, especially as mercenaries. And this was good for them because these fighters wore heavy armor, armored horses, great blacksmiths, and they were very well trained. So when they moved into the army, when they successfully completed these campaigns, they were rewarded with lands, titles. That was in Britannia and in Europe. Now, in Europe, they ended up siding with the invaders, which were actually closer to them than the Romans when Rome started to fall. That's how they were able to maintain their positions, their titles, their roles on into today. Even today, you see Alans in the lineages of a lot of royalty in Europe. That's not how they maintained position in Britannia. The invaders were not their friends. When Rome pulled out of Britannia before the fall of Rome, they left a power vacuum. Londinium, you may have heard of, which is still to this day never fallen. The queen cannot enter Londinium, or no, queen, sorry. The king cannot enter Londinium without asking permission in London. I don't know if you guys know that. That's because Londinium has not fallen since the Roman period. Those guilds Those trade guilds are a big part of why England's capitalism is so effective and was throughout history, because those guilds had some momentum to them. They were defended by the first Arthur. And a bunch of Indo-Iranian heavily armored knights, the proto-knights. These were the mercenaries that had been brought in and given lands, and they're thinking, wait a minute, I want to defend what I fought for this. So they join with the Roman leader who leads them, they back him, and they defend Britannia from a number of incursions. This happens again and again throughout history, where Britain's going to have to defend itself, and the person who leads the charge becomes associated with Arthur. There are many historical Arthur figures, but this is the big historical trauma, and this is the big historical moment. And who was surrounding that Roman leader but a bunch of Indo-Iranian soldiers, warriors in heavy armor, armored horses, as he mentioned, wearing pants. So this is how they maintained position in Britain. Now, shifting from the history, how we recognize this, one of the ways we see this is that the aesthetics carry over. We go into, as John mentioned, we go into the Roman era, go into the medieval period looking like Romans in Europe, and we come out, Europe comes out looking like a lot like Iranians. Why? This is why. This is why. Here you see a Sarmatian in heavy armor on an armored horse. But it wasn't just the men, the warriors in heavy armor with long swords and lances wearing pants on heavily armored horses, which we recognize, of course, from like Sword in the Stone or any medieval anything, but also the ladies in long dresses with pointy hats and towers with handkerchiefs. That was already there in the North Caucasus. The Caucasians of the North Caucasus were already doing that thing that we think of as medieval by 1200 BC, jousting. You heard these stories about pulling a lance out of the ground? Those lances were there a long time before they were in Europe. Okay, so the aesthetics are coming in, the pants, the hemp clothing. Let's now dive into the myths. And this is where I'd like to spend most of my time. John and I'm not an Iranian specialist of any kind. There are a lot of ways. This has been an education to me all day. It's fantastic, and I'm deeply grateful. What I have focused on with John has a lot to do with iron and steel. The reason I am here and am part of this at all is because of how I recognize patterns. And so what I want to show you is a set of patterns that have to do with steel making that show up in the Indo-Iranian material, and they're very unique in the way they appear in the Indo-Iranian material. And when we see these very unique details show up again in Arthurian material, we can connect the historical dots. And we can say, holy cow, that core of Excalibur is actually Indo-Iranian. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. So first I want to point out that the split from the Indo-Europeans and Indo-Iranians was before the Iron Age, 2000, 1500 BC. The Iron Age starting 1200 BC, maybe a little bit earlier for these pioneers, but either way, that split is not after the birth of iron. So the iron motifs you see in the Indo-Iranian material are not there in the Indo-European material. This is important because the Indo-Europeans were already in Europe, already in Britain, so we need to differentiate this new material coming in. We need to know that this stuff coming in was not already there. It wasn't because the Iron Age, the iron material was not already there in the Indo-European material. So I'm going to give you the quencher that they use. And again, a lot of this is from this incredible book. I highly encourage you guys, check it out, from 𝗕𝘂𝗵𝗵𝗺. This is their clenching argument. And it's what John said. He was kind to hold the last punch. And you know how he said that there's a story of the Uyghurs, a Uyghur story? And you guys know who the Uyghurs are, right? People we're all really worried about. So there's a Uyghur story, and there's a story of the Caucasus of a ruler telling his attendant, as he's dying, throw my sword into the lake. And the attendant says, yeah, sure, fakes it twice. Finally throws it in on the third time. Very specific. In these two Indo-Iranian stories. Well, it's in another story. It's in Arthurian legend. It's the death of Arthur. The death of Arthur, he tells his attendant, 𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗵, take my sword to the water, throw it back in so the lady in the lake can retrieve it, reclaim it. He fakes it twice, finally throws it in the third time. That is very specific. So here you see this key detail of betrothed, here then, and Arthur. What does that have to do with steel? Why would the sword go back into the lake? Well, any of you are mythologists, are familiar with the idea of womb to tomb, that you want to be entombed in the womb. You want to die into the place through which you'll be reborn. So you want to go back from where you came. So the Lady of the Lake is the one who gives the sword out of the lake. And now we're going to go back into the lake. This is a womb to tomb thing. But what does that have to do with the sword? Why is the sword going in and out of a lake? Well, let's go from the end of Excalibur, the end of Betroz's sword, and how they're run next to each other, and compare them to the beginning. Well, this takes us into, and I'm going to have to skip some steps instead of doing everything because I want to get us through it. So the very first swords, the first metal strong enough to make a sword was iron. The first iron we ever used was made of meteors. The first iron swords were meteor swords. Okay? And when we worked the swords, the earliest iron swords, we took them out of water. We quenched them in the water. They're hot. Put them in the water. Take them out. Put them in the water. Take them out. Put it 3 times. Typically 3 times. In and out of the water 3 times. To quench it. That gives us a hard skin on the outside. So you noticing the 3 times of the water, 3 times out? At the beginning and at the end? These are symmetries of the birth and death of that sword. So that quenching, this quenching, and let me tell you something about quenching. Where you hold something when you quench it, it tempers unevenly. That is its weak spot. And in a whole other presentation, we talk about how this is actually the true source of the Achilles story and the Siegfried story. That it's where you're dipping the iron, that it tempers unevenly, and it has its weak spot. But it has this hard skin on the outside of it. Excalibur, actually, Arthur is impervious in the early versions as long as he has the scabbard of Excalibur, that special skin around it, that special skin that is the iron armor, that special skin that Jason of the Caucasus, the same area, when Jason goes to the Caucasus, will be dipped in the water and get this special iron skin. Not iron skin, in his case, hard skin. It's not detailed specifically as iron, but that's what it is. All these hard skins are what happen when you quench. And when you quench iron that's hard. Okay, so into and from the water, the quenching, the Lady of the Lake, womb, tomb, okay? But why the stone? This is really a special one for me, the double origin of Excalibur. Excalibur is said to come from a stone and come from a lake. How the hell could it come from both? Well, it comes from a lake because iron swords literally come out of water. You do draw a sword out of water when you're making it. That's the final thing you do. But you also take it out of that meteor stone first. So first is the sword taken from the meteor stone, the sword drawn from the meteor, sword drawn from the stone, then drawn from the water. Okay, so now that we have the meteor stone, let's think about the meteor stone and skipping all the iblis and fallen light and all that stuff for another day. But let's first just focus on the fact that the fallen stone, the fallen meteor stone, comes down as a light from the heavens. And when you turn this light from the heavens, that is a stone, into a sword, the mythopoeic right to rule is immediately obvious to those that want to see it that way, right? You see, the divine light came down as a stone. I took the sword from that stone. I represent the divine light. The divine right to rule has to do with the sword and the stone, has to do with the fact that it's a meteor, the divine light coming down. Okay, so these are these key motifs, and I'm going to have to cruise this on through because I promised that I would do a good job of sticking within 15 minutes. And I think I only have a few extra because of John's generosity. So also, the Grail itself comes down as a stone, the Grail stone, Wolfram. Wolfram may have actually had an Elan story that he was turning into the story of the Grail stone. It is given from the heavens by the neutral angels. So here you have the stone coming down from the heavens, and I was lucky on that TV show we talked about to have a chance to connect the commonality of Excalibur and the Grail both as expressions of a meteor. Okay, so what I want to now just kind of, he mentioned the whole piece where the sword is driven deep into the ground, pulled out, another key Arthurian motif, or the anvil driven in, pulled out, key Arthurian motif, where only the one who can draw the special thing out is the hero, is the one with the right to rule. So you see all these elements of Excalibur are there in steel. I'm taking John's 3. Are there in steel. But also, not only are these key motifs that are related to steel there in both the Indo-Iranian material and then later in the Arthurian, because steel actually turns into motifs all over the place. We can see the whole collection. I love going through the collection, but when we look at a couple of these examples, the detail is ridiculous. Specifically, the part where the sword is thrown into the lake and refused a few times. So that's, for us, critical. We're trying to track. We're trying to show how the import of the Indo-Iranian material, of this Arthurian material, is related to the moving of iron into Europe and iron work. Okay, so I want to make my last key point here, and that is that he said that the warband is egalitarian. There's a repetition of this egalitarian thing in the round table. And the Narts indeed had a little round table, and they cared a lot about egalitarian values, not just because of the warband, but also because the arrival of iron, which they're a major part of, disrupt the Bronze Age collapse. Before the Bronze Age collapse, no leading civilization was Indo-European. After the Bronze Age collapse, give it a century or two, they're all Indo-European. They're all using iron. The Indo-Europeans, iron came in together, changing the whole world, transforming the whole world. And what did they transform? They brought down the Golden Age, the Bronze Age, the age of tyranny, which we actually just recently saw a repetition of that same story in the story of the king who uses the banner to lead his people against this tyrant. Same story, anti-tyranny. We want freedom. Screw your tyranny, right? And so I wanted to get to that key point because I wanted to say that the emergence of iron is also related to the iron coming into the Arthurian material with an emphasis on the egalitarian attitude that shows in the Round Table actually goes back to an older trauma that I mentioned before, the Bronze Age collapse, which was an egalitarian overthrow of tyrants that all these Indo-Europeans and Indo-Iranians were a major part of. And so what I want to land on is just this point, because I know there's this sensitivity of, don't you bring your Western democracy to us, don't you invade us with your belief systems. But what I want to point out is that egalitarianism is actually already a core belief in the Indo-Iranian material. And that the spread of that egalitarianism into Europe, Europe may be representing it, America may be representing it in some ways, but we can track a good bit of that thread, of course, to the Native Americans, of course, to Greeks, but absolutely also to Indo-Iranians through the Round Table, the Arthurian tradition, and its emphasis on equality and freedom. And so I wanted to land on that because I know I feel like that's an important thing to many of you and a lot of what many of you are talking about and interested in. And I think that's all I have. Thanks.
𝗕𝘂𝗰𝗵 is an eminent scholar poet of the imagination. Mr. 𝗕𝘂𝗵 is the author of 5 books on the imagination in religion, the arts, and the sciences. He is the author of the first book in English on Henri Corbin, the French philosopher, theologian, and scholar I spoke of earlier, who was perhaps the most important and influential European interpreter and translator of Iranian thought, from Zoroastrianism to the present. Mr. 𝗕𝘂𝗵 lectures frequently online and in person in US, Europe, and Brazil. I myself discovered him at the same time I discovered Corbin as an unparalleled charter of the Iranian mythic landscape, because their 2 names are inseparable. Have you ever wondered why Mazdaist figures are always shown with wings? Well, please welcome 𝗕𝘂𝗵𝗵 as he joins us from his home in Maine to teach us about Henri Corbin and Zoroastrian angelology in a talk titled The Angel Out Ahead.
Hi, thanks a lot for introducing me. So let's see, I've set my timer for roughly 20 minutes, so we'll see what happens. I want to do 2 things. Since we're going to be talking about the Iranian mythos and mythology, I want to motivate mythology a little bit, because I've been reading Henri Corbin on and off for 30 years now. And when I first read his work, coming from philosophy and the sciences, it was kind of a shock, and I didn't know how to interpret it. But I kind of thought that I'd done a pretty good job of getting inside his worldview until just the last few weeks. And now I think I have really, I got a deeper level of understanding, or at least a different level of understanding, and for 2 reasons. One, textual. I read a bunch of books, which I won't go into right now, but that was a textual hermeneutic. And the other thing I did was go to Brazil and engage in some rituals with plant medicines. I actually think that the reading was more transformative than the plant medicines. But when you put the two things together, it really made a deep impression on me. And I understand Corbin, I think, a little bit better. And let me say this. It's not so much mythology that we're dealing with. I dare say it's poetics, in the sense that James Hillman talks about the poetic basis of mind, and Jung and Corbin and pretty much every artist who ever lived thinks in terms of the creative imagination. So that is all there in a mythology. But also, I think a really evocative and useful term is to think in terms of magic. Not in the derogatory sense, but in the complex anthropologist sense of a form of experience which is based on participation and analogical thinking and a kind of poetic approach to the world. Now, the bad news is that I actually think that in order to regain, and I think we were all born with this, or at least almost all of us, it's a childlike approach to the world, at least in some senses. And in two components seem to me now to be really important in the attempt to recapture that lost, and it's not innocence, but that lost sensibility of participation and analogical thinking. And the two components are fear and Sophia, that is the feminine angel, the feminine energies of reality. It occurs to me that without a little bit of fear, the world tends to solidify, and we tend to take it for granted. And too much fear, and obviously that's not good at all. But if you have, my intuition tells me now, and I think Corbin maybe was in this place, that's merely a suggestion. If you know that the world is a pretty changeable, malleable, fluid, hermetic, mercurial, alchemical kind of place, and if you also have a little bit of access to the feminine energies of the world, Corbin's sophiology, if those two things are in some kind of balance, which they can be for children, though they aren't always, for sure, then I think you have the kind of, we say psychological, and that gives the wrong impression, but let's use it. And then you have the kind of psychological access to this mysterious, magical, astonishing, frightening, and joyful world. And I do not think we can understand certainly what Corbin thinks he's doing with Zoroastrian angelology until we have some sort of access to that kind of psychic, for lack of a better word, state. I think he had that as a very young man, and he never lost it. So what he was looking for was a way to understand the imagination as the central facet, the central fact of reality. And late in his life, he said, for a long time, I had been searching like a young philosopher for the key to this world of the imagination as a real world, which is neither the sensible world nor the world of abstract concepts. And he says, it was in Iran itself that I had to find it. in the two ages of the spiritual world of Iran. And for Corbin, that was Mazdaism, Zoroastrianism, and then Islam. Okay, I'm just going to talk about the Zoroastrian part very, very briefly, with the intent of whetting your interest so that you'll go and look at Corbin. His writings can be very difficult, but they aren't always. And I'm going to draw here very, very quickly on two sources primarily, and a relatively early piece, though he was already a sophisticated and totally mature thinker, that he wrote in about the 1951 called Cyclical Time in Mazdaism and Ismailism. Because, of course, for Corbin, the first spiritual age is Zoroastrianism. And then the second, and that's a pretty dense and difficult essay, but the second source will be his great book, Spiritual Body and Celestial Earth. And though if you're not used to reading accounts of mythological realities, it can be sort of daunting. The preface and his first introductory description of the readings which follow from some of his Iranian masters is fun and interesting to read. But as I said, as I was coming to this the first time, what is this? He says, when he was given a manuscript copy of 𝗕𝗁𝗺, the great 12th century Islamic mystic by 𝗕𝗵𝗵, he says, late in his life, he said, through my meeting with 𝗕RAVARDI, my spiritual destiny for the passage through this world was sealed. And here's the thing that just knocked me out 30 years ago. Platonism, expressed in terms of the Zoroastrian angelology of ancient Persia, illuminated the path that I was seeking. And I thought simultaneously, wow, okay. This guy's crazy. And then, but I know he's a serious person because he was the first French translator of Heidegger. So what is going on here? And I launched into 30 years of trying to figure out what's going on. And just half an hour ago, as I was pondering these thoughts, I realized one of the things that Corbin is worried about, particularly in the prelude to the fifth printing of the second edition of Spiritual Body and Celestial Earth, he's kind of mad at Hillman and Miller and other people at the Eranos conferences, though he doesn't name them, because he's really worried that they've taken his beautiful mundus imaginalis and they've brought it to America where all hell broke loose. And he's very concerned about it. And I've been often very kind of, critical of Corbin for being a stuffy old man. On the other hand, I mean, it literally just occurred to me that if you're the kind of person who can take mythology as seriously as he did, both spiritually and philosophically, and as a lived experience of reality, then there is something kind of fragile about it. In the modern world, if you bring it out onto Fifth Avenue or wherever you live, onto Sunset Boulevard, and you just let yourself get immersed in the modern world, it tends to shatter. And I think one of the things that we might think about from that is the transition from being a small person, a small human being, and if you're lucky, you had a protected enough early period where you were allowed to think in this magical way. And there's eventually a clash that happens. And this may be analogically similar to what Corbin was worried about. He said, give this to the Americans and look what they do with it. They drag it into the 20th century and it just can't survive that. And I am now much more sympathetic because you've got the you've got the childhood fragility and fear, and you've got that mother thing, which I must say is not all that strong in contemporary intellectual cultures and in many aspects of contemporary life as a whole. And so Corbin maybe was feeling that, saying, boy, no, really, this is a real thing, but it's a little bit fragile. Okay. So there he is saying that my life has been organized around the principles of Zoroastrian angelology and Platonism. And what does he get from that? In that first section of Cyclical Time essay, there are so many riches that have been drawn on by poets in the United States, at least, Charles Olson among them. And there's so many exciting things once you get inside this, once you start to take it. And here I think James Hillman is a little bit helpful, though I'm in flux right now. But Hillman says, you know, these things, you take them seriously, but not literally. And I think one of the characteristics of modern life is that we have a tendency to take everything literally. And it takes a lot of training to learn what it means to take something passionately, personally, transformatively, but not literally, as if it could be, you know, measured and weighed. And that takes a lot of practice. And one of the things that's close, that got me sort of close to that, was reading about Buddhism. You know, everything's illusion. Even the rocks are illusion. And if you can get that into your head, that even the rocks are illusory, then I think this starts to become more livable. Because for Corbin, this was his life. And the first thing that struck him about Zoroastrian angelology, and of course he was in his 40s at least when he started getting into this, so he knew these ideas from medieval Christian history. But what he loved about Zoroastrian angelology is that the entire cosmos was made of persons. Even time is a person. Everything has at least a little fragment of personhood, because if it didn't, it wouldn't exist at all. We don't have time to try to open that out and let it blossom, but I'm convinced that anything that we experience as human beings is, in fact, personified. And there's good anthropologists who would more or less agree that the fundamental foundations of human cognition involve animism. Not everyone agrees, but it's a pretty common idea that our world is at root animistic. And for Corbin, it runs from the bottom all the way to the top, and he gets a lot of that from the Neoplatonists and then the Zoroastrians. So what is involved here is a world full of persons. Which is therefore accessible through the imagination, because this gets complicated and glorious and exciting beyond explanation. But the best, perhaps the only way to engage in relationship is personally. And for the ancient Zoroastrians and Corbin and a number of contemporary thinkers who I could name, our relationship with the world is relational through and through. And for Corbin, the way to talk about that most easily is by saying that every being is a person. Now, the cool thing is that every being of light, he would say, because he gets that from the Mazdians, every being of light is in syzygy with its divine twin. And the idea of a divine twin shows up all sorts of places and is a very hot topic of scholarly discussion in many quarters. But Corbin is totally invested in the idea of your celestial twin, which he derives directly from the Zoroastrian mythologies. So every being of light has a divine twin, and a really nice contemporary version of that idea can be found in the scholar of comparative religion at Rice, 𝗕𝗂𝗵𝗵𝗺, who calls it the human as two. And he puts it this way, as a couple sentences, so I'll read it a little bit slowly. This is a contemporary religious scholar making this claim very seriously and maybe even literally. Each human being is two. That is, each person is simultaneously a conscious, constructed self or socialized ego. We got that now in our time. And a much larger, complexly conscious field. That's Corbin's angel, that normally manifests only in non-ordinary states of consciousness. Okay, mystical transport, sure, which the religious traditions have historically objectified, mythologized, and projected outward into the sky as divine, or introjected inward into the human being as nirvana, Brahma, or whatever. So this is an idea that Corbin was passionately committed to all throughout his writings, that he traces back to the Mazdians, and that we can find totally contemporaneously in our time being argued for. The super cool thing about the idea of the angel out ahead in Corbin that he gets from the Zoroastrians is that every being of light has an angel out ahead. And the angel out ahead is sort of leading you on. If you lose contact with your angel, then you are, Corbin says, lost in vagabondage and perdition. If you think you might have an angel, then you're probably okay. But if you've totally given up any idea that you might have an angel, that's it. That's it for your soul. The super cool idea is that even the supreme being has an angel out ahead, right? All the angels have angels, and even 𝗪𝗛 has an angel out ahead. Because if he didn't, you see what would happen. He'd turn around and he'd say, I am supreme, and I am God, and I am perfect, and I am powerful. Wham! And he'd just freeze up solid, and everything that exists around him would just freeze up solid, and we'd be done. No, the supreme being has to have an angel out ahead. It keeps him saying, oh shit, there she goes, and I've got to keep, this is going to go on forever. And so it's the motive power of the entire universe. So if you take this seriously, but not literally, it's kind of 𝗏𝗏𝗺ian. It's a kind of strange process theology, And for Corbin, the only way to understand this properly is to recognize that all these forces have to be engaged as persons. And underlying all this, or surrounding all this, or both, is the figure of the angel of the earth, of Sophia. And of course, the Sophia tradition goes deep everywhere. One of Corbin's arguments, which he shared with Jung and many others, is that in the modern Protestant West, and not so much, kind of lost that whole thing. And so one of the virtues of reading Corbin's accounts of Zoroastrian geosophy and sophiology is to try to get some connection to this kind of imagination of the world, and by God, it will do you good.
Amazing.
All right.
Thank you.
That was good.
I'd like to introduce you next to Ethan Friedland. Mr. Friedland is a PhD student in the Iranian Studies subdivision of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA. His research interests include the development of Iranian religious traditions, from the Avestan to the Pahlavi texts, the interactions between ancient Judaism and Iran, and the specific role of the Achaemenid Empire in both of these contexts. I met him at the Achaemenid workshop at UCLA in April, so not too long ago, and when he told me about his work on the Avestan, I knew he had to be here. Today, Mr. Friedland will offer some introductory remarks on the Avestan before taking a comprehensive look at an Avestan term, which has attracted his attention and is likely new to most of us. His talk is titled "The Personal and Impersonal Aspects of Avestan Hąm.varəiti."
If you're to trust me.
Please welcome Ethan Friedland.
Thank you. Does this work? Excellent. Well, thank you very much to Cross-Cultural Expressions, and in particular, Dr. Maryam Sayad, who very kindly invited me to apply, and I'm very grateful to be here. To start, I will also apologize in advance because this lovely Yasna manuscript might be the most interesting image I show you today. The Avesta and ancient Zoroastrianism at large is generally aniconic. They do not like images, and it means a historian like myself does not have a lot of cool stuff to show you. However, these texts are incredibly rich, and I hope that at the very least they will paint a picture for you. Okay. So, let me make sure I know how to do this. There we go. My presentation will attempt to elucidate the meaning, function, and significance of an enigmatic term, Hąm.varəiti, found in an enigmatic text, the Young Avesta. For those who don't know, the Avesta is a collection of hymns and liturgy, which forms the basis of the Zoroastrian religion. And today I'll be exploring many passages from these texts. Before we get started, I'll provide a little background information here because the Avesta, despite its age, richness, and significance, is not often included in the canon of world mythology. The many different texts of the Avesta preserve a fascinating glimpse at some of the earliest Iranian religious traditions on the historical record. The exact date of these texts is difficult to determine, and it's a hotly debated topic, and I will spare you any debate here today. Estimates range from 1200 BCE at the earliest to 400 BCE at the latest. These poems, hymns, and liturgies were transmitted orally for centuries, just like the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Hindu Vedas, and eventually put to text at a later date. This great chain of transmission is both an incredible accomplishment on the part of the poets, worshippers, and reciters, but also a testament to the enduring power of these texts and the stories that they tell. We can be a little more confident in our geographic estimate, but only a little. The mention of certain ethnic groups and geographical features in the Avesta, such as the Helmand River and Afghanistan, allow us to place the Avestan texts in the Eastern Iranian world. That is, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, and the eastern edges of modern Iran. I've highlighted some of these key features: the Helmand River, known as the 𝗕𝗵𝗄 in Avestan, the northmost branch of the Amu Darya River, known as the 𝗕𝘂𝗰𝗵, and the Indus River and its tributaries, which the Avesta terms the 𝗵𝗵, the 7 Indian rivers. Here's another map without modern borders, which does a good job indicating the Avesta's origin in the eastern edge of the Iranian world, on the border of the Indian subcontinent. Of course, like all things Avesta, these geographic origins are again hotly debated. Nevertheless, it's most likely from these hazy confines that the great Iranian religious and mythic tradition emerged, and we've seen much of that today. The Avesta introduces us to the great gods Ahura Mazda, Mithra, and the goddess Anahita, introduces us to the Halma ritual and the 𝗕₃ prayer, and to the great heroes Feridun and Garshasp and the villain Zahak, who are later immortalized in the Shahnameh. It is these texts, the kernels from which the vast Iranian religious tradition emerged from, that I will be exploring today. The Avesta contains so much, yet the difficulty of this language and its study has greatly hindered our understanding of this Avestan world. The relative scarcity of research on the topic, compared to the better studied world of Homer, for example, and the inaccessible nature of much of this research adds further stumbling blocks to the prospective student of Iranian religions. There's much that we don't know about the Avesta, and there's much work to be done. We don't know really when or where these texts were composed with any certainty, and even some of the key figures and concepts in the Avesta remain enigmatic. Hąm.varəiti is one such case. The term 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗃 and its derivations appear 15 times throughout the diverse texts of the Avesta in many forms and contexts, most notably in 𝗪𝗔 11.2, which ties the term to the cosmic struggle that lies at the heart of Zoroastrian dualism, asserting 𝗪𝗶𝗵𝗺 is the best armor against the lie. Further, 𝗕𝗵𝗺 is one of 4 figures in the Avesta qualified by the adjective 𝗕𝗵𝗲𝗵, meaning sleepless, denoting invulnerability against the demons that attack the sleeping form. There are only 3 other sleepless figures in the Avesta, and they are no less than 𝗕𝗏, Mythra, and 𝗪𝗆, 3 of the most important gods. So who or what is this protective 𝗕𝗵𝗺 that stands against the greatest evil, the cosmic lie? Who or what is this figure which appears parallel to the creator god 𝗕𝗏, the sun god Mythra, and the great protector god 𝗪𝗆? Scholarship, of course, does not present a single answer. In 1929, the American scholar Louis H. Gray wrote the most comprehensive treatment of this term 𝗕𝗵𝗺, totaling 3 paragraphs. Yeah. In it, he notes that the term is grammatically feminine and argues that 𝗕𝗵𝗺 is a war goddess and a protective figure. He derives her name from the root var, meaning to cover, the same root which gives rise to more familiar Avestan terms like vara, enclosure, varathra, obstacle or defense, and the god's name varathraghna, defense smashing. Therefore, Gray translates 𝗕𝗵𝗺 to mean protection or defense. Many scholars, particularly in Europe, follow his argument, at least as pertains to the translation. However, in 1959, 𝗕𝗂𝗫𝗄𝗃, a rather famous Iranist, advanced an opposing argument tangentially while hypothesizing a new definition for the related term varathra. He argued, in the span of a few sentences, that 𝗕𝗵𝗺 is derived from an identical root var with a different meaning comparable to Latin valeo or English valor. To this day, most scholars translate 𝗕𝗵𝗺 in accordance with 𝗕𝗁𝗫 to mean valor or courage. 𝗕𝗁𝗫 took 𝗕𝗵𝗺 to be a common noun, and perhaps he was right. In the passage he was referring to, 𝗕𝗵𝗺 indeed appears as a common noun, where in other passages it appears as a proper noun, the name of a goddess. Scholars have since taken one side or another on all of these issues. However, these agreements only occur in lines of translation. To date, Louis H. Gray in 1929 is the only one who ever devoted more than a few sentences to the topic. Therefore, 𝗕𝗵𝗺, despite its theological prominence, is often forgotten. So my paper is the first attempt at a comprehensive study of every single attestation of the term 𝗕𝗵𝗺 in the hope of identifying the term's meaning and its place within the Avestan cosmos. In this survey of every single mention, I identify the numerous semantic and grammatical roles of 𝗕𝗵𝗺. Throughout the Avesta, the term represents an anthropomorphic goddess, an adjective or quality, and an abstract force that empowers gods and heroes alike. However, these categories are anything but rigid. In fact, 𝗕𝗵𝗺 regularly defies these categories within a single passage, as in Yasna 62, 4-5, "Give to me, O Attar, son of Ahura Mazda, swift power. Give me the heroic 𝗕𝗵𝗺, straight-legged, unsleeping, of unused bed, and alert. Give to me my own child reaching maturity." Here, the Avestan worshiper requests 𝗕𝗵𝗺 alongside other gifts or boons like power or the birth of a child. 𝗕𝗵𝗺 is therefore an abstract concept, a power or reward that one can request, which gods bestow to the righteous. Yet the same 𝗕𝗵𝗺 is also straight-legged and unsleeping, and therefore a goddess with personal characteristics. 𝗕𝗵𝗺 is a term which consistently defies classification. I argue that it's through this overlap, this multivalence, that 𝗕𝗵𝗺's true nature becomes apparent, and so we'll dive into all of these complexities. First, it's important to identify that 𝗕𝗵𝗺 is, in fact, a yazata. A yazata is a technical term in the Avesta identifying a concept or a being that's deserving of sacrifice. It is usually paired with the first plural verb, yazamaida, meaning we sacrifice to. In a few places in the Young Avesta, the worshipper offers sacrifice to 𝗕𝗵𝗺, and therefore, 𝗕𝗵𝗺 is a yazata, something worthy of sacrifice. So, for example, in the 22nd day of the Siroza calendar dedications, we see, "We sacrifice to heroic 𝗕𝗵𝗺." And mind you, this word heroic, _, is derived from the same word as nart, warrior, hero. In the Vysperad ceremony, which extends the standard liturgy on solemn occasions, we find a larger attestation. "We sacrifice to heroic 𝗕𝗵𝗺, who encourages warriors and men, who's swifter than swift, braver than brave, who comes to him that is allotted by God, who, having seized the bodies of warriors, bestows the Savior. And finally, in the hymn to the 𝗪𝗏, later known as the 𝗪, we sacrifice to 𝗪𝗏𝗵𝗺𝗪ti, straight-legged, unsleeping, of unused bed, alert, who accompanied 𝗪𝗏𝗃. However, it's not so straightforward because a 𝗪𝗏𝗃 is not synonymous with a god. In fact, many non-divine beings, such as the 𝗕𝗏𝗍s, and abstract concepts such as health or safety, receive sacrifice in the Avesta. To understand 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗇, we must look further. What we can note here, however, is 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗇's specific affiliation with warriors. 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗇 encourages the warriors, is associated with heroism and bravery, and accompanies 𝗪𝗏𝗃, one of the greatest Iranian heroes, who's later known as 𝗪𝗏𝗃. I'll now turn to 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗇 in association with two major gods, perhaps acting as a goddess. Gods in the Avesta are often accompanied by a retinue of other deities, and therefore an examination of 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗇 alongside other deities may lend insight into the term's function. In the hymn to 𝗪𝗏, Yash 1066, the god 𝗪𝗏 rides across the sky in his solar chariot, followed by good 𝗪𝗍, the goddess of fortune, Paranda with fast chariots, the goddess of plenty, the mighty 𝗪𝗏𝗵𝗺𝗃, the mighty 𝗕₂���, again later known as the 𝗪, the mighty 𝗕𝗨 set in place by itself, the mighty 𝗕𝗏𝗆𝗄, and the mighty 𝗕𝗏𝗍s of the orderly. It's important to note that the retinue of an Avestan god often reflects and embodies their principal functions, otherwise I probably wouldn't read all that out to you today. Thus, the goddesses 𝗪𝗍 and Paranda both reflect 𝗕thra's fecund role as the sun god, the bringer of fertility and plenty. 𝗕thra is also protector of the pact, the verbal agreement between individuals or tribes, and in this latter role he is described with the same words that qualify 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗇, straight-legged, unsleeping, alert. It's long been recognized that these qualities of 𝗕thra reflect his role as a sleepless protector of the pact. As a member of 𝗕thra's retinue and carrying the same adjectives, it's likely that 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗇 serves a similar protective function, though it appears that 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗇's specific affiliation is with warriors rather than the pact. However, 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗇's divinity remains unclear. Of 𝗕thra's retinue here, sure, 𝗪𝗍, Paranda, 𝗕𝗨, and 𝗕𝗏𝗆𝗆𝗆 are all deities, but the 𗗪𝗏 is of uncertain divinity, and the 𝗕𝗏𝗍s are certainly not gods. How do we know whether 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗇 is here a goddess or simply a power or a force accompanying 𝗕thra? Our next passage may provide something of an answer, or perhaps it'll complicate everything further, such is often the case with the Avesta. Yash 11 presents 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗇 parallel to 𝗪𝗆𝗆, the protector god, god of prayer, who's subject to this hymn. It begins saying, we worship 𝗪𝗆𝗆, etc., and then it goes in saying, prayer that is an ally, the most repellent against the deceitfulness of the deceitful ones, that is the best protection against the deceitful ones and their daring eyes, ears, legs, and mouths. That which is good prayer, unlying, non-hostile. Heroic 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗇 is the best armor against the lie. Blessed 𝗪𝗆𝗆 is the best protector of the poor. He is victorious. He is the best killer of the lie. Here, 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗇 is the best defense against the lie, and 𝗪𝗆𝗆 is the best offense against the lie. We could say that 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗇 is a deity in 𝗪𝗆𝗆's retinue, comparable to what we saw with 𝗕thra, and that 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗇 embodies or reflects 𝗪𝗆𝗆's efficacy against the lie. Again, both are qualified by the same adjective, they're unsleeping protectors. However, the nearby passages also praise the concept of prayer in general, as well as the _Mathra Spenta, the life-giving mantras, and the 𝗪𝗏𝗃, the most important prayer in the Avesta. Like 𝗪𝗆𝗆, all of these concepts parallel 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗇 in its semantic and grammatical function in the hymn. So is 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗇 a deity fighting alongside 𝗪𝗆𝗆 against the lie, or is 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗇 an abstract concept, more of a tool comparable to the 𝗪𝗏𝗃 prayer? We're beginning to see this multivalence, 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗇's inability to fit a single classification, and in order to maybe clarify, we'll turn to more texts. We find three passages where an adjective has been derived from the term 𝗕𝗵𝗺𝗇. The stem 𝗫 or vat is the Avestan equivalent to English full, as in plentiful. The 𝗫 stem connotes that the subject is possessed of, full of, or endowed with whatever quality is represented in the noun. To be 𝗪𝗏𝗆 is to be full of power or powerful. To be drugvant is to be full of lie or deceitful. What does it mean to be 𝗕𝗵𝗆𝗆? Yasna 57:33 at the top is the heart of the daily liturgy, and it reads, "We sacrifice to all the victories of 𝗪𝗍 the Blessed, the brave one who stretches poetic thought, the brave one possessed of 𝗕𝗵𝗲𝗵, 𝗕𝗵𝗲𝗵, the strong-armed charioteer who smashes the heads of 𝗪𝗵s." And 𝗪𝗵s are, of course, the Avestan term for 𝗪𝗵s, demons. Yash 13:33, the hymn to the 𝗕RVHs reads, "We sacrifice to the good, powerful, life-giving 𝗕RVHs of the orderly, who are brave, possessed of Hąm-varəiti, battling, bloodthirsty, and soulful, who break all the hostilities of their opponents, 𝗪𝗵s and mortals. The 𝗕RVHs who, for their own pleasure, strike down enemies with strength." So I hope it's quite clear that to be possessed of Hąm-varəiti is to be a supreme warrior of praiseworthy exploits who, in the case of 𝗪𝗍 and the 𝗕RVHs, protects the righteous by combating the 𝗪𝗵s. We must analyze this 𝗪𝗍 passage in the light of the previous one that I just talked about, which presents Hąm-varəiti as a deity or a concept fulfilling 𝗪𝗍's protective role. As I mentioned before, minor deities in the Avesta often embody or reflect the function of the greater god which they follow. This voice employs the term Hąm-varəiti as a quality of 𝗪𝗍, which, in Yasht 11.2, is perhaps a deity honored alongside this same 𝗪𝗍. From a synchronic perspective, that is, taking the Avesta as a complete and finished text, Hąm-varəiti is both the quality that enables 𝗪𝗍 to overcome the lie and the deity which accompanies him in this fight. The Yasna 57 hymn to 𝗪𝗍 invokes the god's protection at a crucial moment in the Yasna ritual when the sacrifice is en route to Ahura Mazda through intermediate space and great power is needed to repel the 𝗪𝗵s, the evil forces. The concept of Hąm-varəiti is therefore invoked in a protective fashion at two junctures of theological significance. This is the 𝗪𝗵 interference I was talking about. Please. Thank you. Excellent. Yes, so two junctures of theological significance. I'll turn to the final passage in which we have Hąm-varəiti as a quality, as an adjective, because it's very interesting. It's praise of the hero 𝗪𝗪, who killed 𝗪𝗍, who is possessed of 𝗪𝗪, brave, beloved, desired one, restless, writhing, alert, who runs first in the battle line, rejoicing in spoils. 𝗪𝗍, who is described as possessing Hąm-varəiti, is an enemy of the hero 𝗪𝗪, and the term writhing is a Davic word, a specific vocabulary dedicated to evil forces, connoting that 𝗪𝗍 belongs to the enemy. This complicates things. Is Hąm-varəiti a quality that villains can possess? I suggest two explanations. The first is that the figure of 𝗪𝗍 possesses some positive attributes, describing his heroism and popularity, and is therefore either a villain with admirable qualities, like Frangrazien, who is later known as 𝗪𝗲 in the Shahnameh, or a censured hero demoted to Davic status, comparable to 𝗕𝗵𝗲, later known as Jamshid. The second option is that Hąm-varəiti and 𝗪𝗍 existed also in a non-Zoroastrian tradition, and 𝗪𝗍's epithets survived absorption into a Zoroastrian hymn. The questions raised by this brief yet enigmatic passage serve as a reminder that Hąm-varəiti and many of the other Avestan characters likely existed in a far broader context than what is available to us today. I'll turn to today's last category, Hąm-varəiti as a boon or a gift that a god bestows, which empowers whoever receives it. We've already seen the first passage, give to me swift power, give to me heroic Hąm-varəiti, straight-legged, unsleeping, of unused bed, alert, give to me my own child. This passage falls within the standard sacrifice formula of the young Avesta, in which the Yazata, the god, provides the sacrificer with a boon in return for a successful offering. Here, Hąm-varəiti is one of many concepts, such as power, which the sacrificer requests of Atar, the god of fire, and the hearth. Yasna 62 here provides greater insight into a segment of Vysparad 7, which we've seen already as well. Hąm-varəiti, who comes to him that is especially allotted by God. The verb to allot or to portion, bag, is derived from the same root as one of the words for God, baga, denoting one who allots. Presumably, this passage here refers to the same type of exchange we see in Yasna 62, where the god Atar gives or allots Hąm-varəiti to the righteous sacrificer. In these next passages, Hąm-varəiti's function as a boon is not immediately apparent in translation until we examine the choice of words in the original language, which is, of course, Avestan. Each yasht presents the concept with a term almost always associated with boons, the prefixed verb 𝗶𝗵𝗆, meaning to accompany or adhere. In the Avestan corpus, this verb often describes the relationship between the sacrificer, the god, and the boon that the god gives. Perhaps most famously, the hymn to the 𝗪𝗺 uses the verb 𝗵𝗵𝗀𝗃 to describe how the �ᵏ, again later known as the 𝗪, accompanies and empowers great heroes such as 𝗔𝗵 and 𝗕ᗏ. In fact, the verb 𝗵𝗵𝗀𝗃 is repeated almost ad nauseum in many yash describing the boons that the heroes receive. So here, the first one, yash 1071, employs the perfect passive participle form, and sorry, that's too grammatical, 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗃, of the same verb to describe Hąm·varəiti's relationship to the subject, 𝗪𝗏. 𝗪𝗏, who's in the shape of a boar, rushes forth from after the enemy, accompanied, together by fury and heroic Hąm·varəiti. He strikes down opponents by the point of his tusks. He does not think he has struck, nor does he even appear to strike when he strikes down vertebrae, the pillars of life, the vertebrae, the springs of vitality. Hąm·varəiti, alongside the concept of fury, emboldens the war god 𝗪𝗏 in his rampage. It's possible that Hąm·varəiti is here a deity fighting alongside 𝗪𝗏, but given the parallel with the concept of fury, which is certainly not a deity, and the use of the verb 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗃, it's far more likely that Hąm·varəiti is acting as an abstract power in this passage. We see the same verb in yash 19 here as 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗃 to describe how the boon Hąm·varəiti accompanies the hero 𝗕𝘂𝗵𝗃 in his various battles against dragons and other evil creatures. So at the bottom here, yash 1939, so that mighty heroic Hąm·varəiti accompanied 𝗕𝘂𝗵𝗃. We sacrificed to heroic Hąm·varəiti, straight-legged, unsleeping, of unused bed, alert, who accompanied 𝗕𝘂𝗵𝗃. Again, the ambiguous nature of Hąm·varəiti allows for an alternative interpretation, that is, a deity accompanying 𝗕𝘂𝗵𝗃. However, yash 1938, the passage just before, states that 𝗕𝘂𝗵𝗃 was the strongest of strong men other than Zarathustra on account of heroic Hąm·varəiti, directly attributing 𝗕𝘂𝗵𝗃's heroic qualities to the empowering force that is Hąm·varəiti. Yet, at the same time, this empowering abstract boon is straight-legged and unsleeping. These passages demonstrate that Hąm·varəiti can indeed function as a boon, yet at every single turn we find the term exceeds any category we seek to impose upon it. I've illustrated how Hąm·varəiti functions as a yasata, a deity, a quality, and a boon. While the nature of Hąm·varəiti varies depending upon the passage, the function of the term remains consistent. Hąm·varəiti is a warlike and protective force that emboldens warriors, both mortal and divine, and protects the righteous against the dangerous forces of the cosmic lie, the great evil of Zoroastrian tradition. Having determined how Hąm·varəiti operates, the question of its divergent nature remains. Thus, we're faced with the personal and the impersonal or abstract conceptions of Hąm·varəiti, yet this apparent contradiction does not need to be a problem. The Indo-Iranian tradition is particularly fluid in this context, allowing for something to be both a divine person and an impersonal phenomenon. And in fact, Corbin's idea, which we just heard, of the inner being, the humanity of an item, is very much at play here. Thus, Atar is both god of fire and the flame itself, and Mithra is both the protector of the pact and the word used to describe the pact. Certainly, the case of Hąm·varəiti suggests that the division between personal and impersonal was either blurred or unimportant, such that a boon could possess an anthropomorphic epithet. Indeed, we can question whether such a distinction even existed in the minds of the Avestan poets and sacrificers. Hąm·varəiti is just one of hundreds of terms that we still struggle to understand and situate within the enigmatic world of the Avesta, the oft-understudied world of the Avesta. Yet by studying this obscure figure, we gain greater insight into the Avesta and Iranian religious traditions at large. It's my hope that such work will continue so that we can uncover all the mysteries we have here. Here, today, I point to the indefinability of Hąm·varəiti to suggest that the ambiguity of Avestan concepts is not an error in need of correction or definition, but rather an integral facet of the ancient Iranian conception of the divine. Thank you.
Scholar, hero, Ethan Friedland. I feel like when we can tell that something is a lie, we have Hąm·varəiti with us. Is that right? Our fourth speaker is 𝗕𝗁𝗵𝗆. Ms. 𝗕𝗁 is a poet, a playwright, a librettist, and translator. Her most recent book, 𝗪𝗵𝗲𝗵𝗺 of Loss, a memoir in verse, was hailed by Colorado Review as a book that examines the masks of patriarchy in powerful metaphor and narrative. 𝗕𝗏𝗆's literary works number over 12 collections of poetry, translations, and anthologies, as well as an oratorio, several plays, and multi-genre productions. She is the recipient of several book awards, including the 2010 Lois Roth Persian Translation Prize. Her translations of Attar's The Conference of the Birds and 𝗕𝗏 فرخزاد have established 𝗕𝗏𝗆 as a celebrated recreator of Persian poetry in English. She is currently writer-in-residence at UC Irvine and divides her time between Irvine, California, and Barcelona, Spain. 𝗕𝗁 has been on my radar for a long time as a true artist, an original thinker, and a radiant caretaker of feminine values. Please welcome 𝗕𝗁.
Is this good? Louder? Louder? All right. You know, I do live part-time in Barcelona. And louder? This is better? Yay. I actually I do live part-time in Barcelona, and the other day I came into the room and said to my dad, hola, salam. My dad said, 𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗺. I said, what? She says, ola خودتی. Just for those who speak Persian. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Simorgh. First of all, I have to say, it's been such an amazing conference, and I feel humbled to be up here because I don't really deserve to be up here with all these stars that have been speaking in such fabulous scholarly ways, and I'm not a scholar, so be prepared for that. So Simorgh, I'm going to talk a little bit about Simorgh and some of the things I just wrote down because I was so inspired here. So Simorgh is a mythological bird. We encounter it in many periods of history and literature in Iran. It is a bird that, according to legends, has seen the destruction of the world many times over. A majestic bird with great plumage that shares features with other legendary birds, especially the western phoenix. And unfortunately, it gets confused with the phoenix. Simorgh is not phoenix. In Iranian art, Simorgh is often depicted as a large bird with, as a creature with wings and feathers. And we can find depictions of Simorgh in many forms, sometimes as a peacock with head of a dog or head of a human. It is considered huge and powerful, more than a dragon. Like, it's huge. So in 𝗕𝗁𝗵𝗵, Simorgh exists as a legendary creature, right? You've been here, you've been hearing about it. It is the savior and protector of Zal and later Rustam. And you know the story, so I don't have to recount it, but you recall the scene between Rustam and 𝗪𝗺𝗺, right? And 𝗪𝗺𝗺 is impervious to harm, and I found out it's because when he was dipped in that special liquid, it closed its eyes, so you could only kill it through his eyes. And then Simorgh tells Rustam this weakness, and then that's how Rustam is able to kill 𝗪𝗺𝗺. So I spoke with my friend, I have a dear friend, Mohsen Ahmadi, who's an encyclopedia of Iranian literature, and he told me about a story by 12th century Iranian scholar 𝗕𝗁h in a book called 𝗕𝗁𝗺𝗱. And here 𝗕𝗁h transforms the story by moving the myth of Simorgh into a theological light. That's what 𝗕𝗁h did a lot. He gave Simorgh the divine light. How did he do that? you know, when you look at the divine, supposedly you lose your sight. The divine is so bright, so divine, right? And so in this story, Simorgh tells Rustam that go out to the battle. You don't need a weapon. Just put on an armor of mirrors. And when he appears, then Simorgh appears behind 𝗪𝗺 and its reflection on the mirror blinds 𝗪𝗺, and that's how he dies. So here the bird taken from this literary, imaginative literary form into a divine light. In a marvelous book called 𝗪𝗵𝗵𝗵, do you know this? This is a really cool book. It's only in Persian. It hasn't been translated. It's called The Book of Marvels, published around the same time in 12th century, just before 𝗕𝗂𝗰𝗵𝗵 recounts a marvelous story about how Simorgh was too arrogant. And the story goes that Simorgh told King Solomon that I can control fate. You think God does that? No. Whatever God decrees as fate, I can change that. And King Solomon says, no, you can't. Well, for example, God has fated this boy to end up with this girl, to marry this girl. And he says, no, I'm going to change that fate. So he grabs the little girl and takes the girl to Mount 𝗄, where it lived. And years pass, and the boy grows up and becomes a traveling merchant. Somehow, when Simorgh is away, he finds himself in Mount 𝗄. He becomes acquainted with the girl, and he mates with the girl. The girl becomes pregnant, right? And then Simorgh is shamed with humility and goes back to King Solomon and says, yes, I don't have the power of the divine. So here's another thing. What I do know a lot about is the Conference of the Bird by Attar. 12th century Sufi mystic poet. The book is called 𝗪𝗆, translated as The Conference of the Birds. Again, it's not a conference, it's a conference. You confer. 𝗪𝗆, Conference of the Birds. And I spent many years recreating this work. And I say recreate because as a writer, as a poet, I know that translation is impossible. Because a literary text occurs in a certain third universe, which is between the subconscious and the conscious. And in order to make translation, you have to transport the text into this other third universe. And within that transportation, you have to recreate it within this subconscious and conscious of this other universe, right? So in Simorgh, what Attar did, he transformed Simorgh into something really sublime in a very interesting way. If you have not read The Conference of the Birds, I urge you to read it and read my translation. So I don't want to lose my train of thought here because I can just go on and on and on. What happened is that, is everybody familiar with the story of the Conference of the Birds? The birds of the world gather and they want to go seek their sovereign. The hoopoe, who was King Solomon's bird, says, I know where this bird lives. I know there is a great bird, this great sovereign, and I can lead you there. It lives in Mount 𝗕, it wraps around the world, let's go. The birds get really, really excited. And they say, let's go. And they take off. And then the unending, arduous road opens up before them. And then they go, ah! And they come back down, and they are shivering, and they're scared, and they don't want to go. Does that sound familiar? We all do that. And so, in a way, Simorgh, in the beginning of the book, is transformed into a psychological destination. And the 𝗵𝗶 is the therapist. So the 𝗵𝗶 tells the birds parables, stories that are entertaining, irreverent, surprising, to help them understand their own fears. And the 𝗵𝗶 tells them the biggest barrier between you and this destination is your own ego. He calls it that cyclone of calamities. And so every bird comes up with their excuse, with their you know, like the nightingale says, oh, how can I leave my rose? I mean, my rose would just wither away without me. And then the 𝗵𝗶 basically tells it stories. You should read that. We don't have time for that. It's so interesting. So they finally decide to take off, and the 𝗵𝗶 takes them through 7 valleys. And now Simorgh is transformed into an emotional destination. What are, Simorgh says, the beloved is a grand ocean in which the garden of paradise is but a tiny ball of dew. If you have the ocean, you have the drop. Don't settle for less. Don't seek anything but the ocean. If you can find your way to vast waters, why rush toward a drop of dew? If you can speak heart to heart with the sun, why have a conversation with a dust mote? If you can contain the whole, why trouble yourself with parts? If you can be a soul, why bother with limbs? If you want to be complete, then look for the whole. Desire all, become all. Choose everything, choose everything. So they take off. They take off, and they are taken through 7 valleys. And these valleys are very important. They get the birds closer to the emotional destination. Just quickly, very, very quickly, like for example, the first one is the Valley of the Quest. Valley of Search, Valley of the Quest. And it's so beautiful. Basically, what it says, I mean, all of us, it really applies to us so much. We're so damn arrogant. And sometimes we don't get even past the first valley. Valley of Search means whatever you believe and don't believe, you have to empty it before you enter this valley. Because if your cup is full of your belief and unbelief, how can you learn anything? How can you fill your cup with anything? And so then they go into the Valley of Love, where heart is fire, mind is smoke. Valley of Knowledge, where worldly knowledge becomes utterly useless. And Valley of Detachment, Valley of Unity, Valley of Wonderment, and finally Valley of annihilation and poverty, where you have to give everything up. I can you can go on and on about these things. We don't have time, because I want to show you a cool video. So all the birds take off. They say, okay, they have taken off, they've gone through these valleys, and of hundreds of thousands of birds, only 30 survive when they arrive at the court of great Simorgh. And then something really fabulous and surprising happens. And when I have what I'm going to show you is the music is by Fahad Siadat, and the choreography is by Andre Megerdician. And we did an oratorio at the at the Broad, but then this is at the Getty Villa Museum. It was something that was commissioned. So this is the end of the story of what happened when the 30 birds arrived. Can we show that?
The moths. Not until the mystic moth threw itself into the flame did it truly mean. No room here for our ego. No room for any kind of self at all.
Although the Almighty's independence is unending, that Great One's grace is also immeasurable. And so the herald opened the door, and the world was uncloaked and became manifest. The birds were bathed in eternal light of lights. The birds at last saw the face of Simorgh, but in reflection. And when they looked closer, they saw the reflection was their own. Simorgh, Simorgh. They were Simorgh, and Simorgh was them. Simorgh means 30 birds.
Simorgh, Simorgh, we are startled, we are amazed. How can they be? We are one and the same. We are Simorgh.
Beloved, unveil the mighty secret. Relieve us of this confusion of identities, this you and us and you, us and you.
A mirror is the beloved's sun-like face. Look into it and see both body and soul, yourself, soul and body, you. You have arrived as 30 birds, and in the mirror you see 30 birds. Had you come as 40 or 50, you'd see in the mirror 40 or 50. Though you've come in great number, you still see yourself. You will always see yourself. All that you have known, all that you have seen were illusions, all of it. Nothing you have said or heard was actually so. The valleys you traversed were in me. The bravery you displayed was mine. Come and obliterate yourselves in me. Become me to find yourself once more.
Come, obliterate yourself in me. Become me to find yourselves once more.
Like a shadow that vanishes in sunlight, the birds surrendered themselves to the Great One and became utterly nothing. Silence fell as pilgrims and their leaders became one with the way. So what's happened? What happened with the Simorgh? Atar transformed Simorgh into a divine being. But that divine being ended up to be within ourselves. So all that therapy, they finally arrive at themselves. And the difference is that you go find yourself and then you emerge as a new being. Very, very important, right? So it's in my translation, this is one last point I'm going to make, and this is really, really important. In Persian, we don't have gender pronouns, as you very well know. We don't have he, she, her, his, right? All the translators of Persian literature before of this particular text and many other texts, they always translate really cool parts for men. Simorgh has always been a he. The birds have been he. All of the cool parts go to men, right? Now, in my translation, I was very careful. I took gender out of it. There is no gender unless, thank you, but unless it is specifically, like when he says the princess, okay, it's a girl, it's a princess. Well, maybe it isn't a girl, I don't know. But maybe that's for the next translator to deal with. But you know what I mean. The other important point about it is religion. I mean, you talked about it, Mariam John, a little bit, that we always put everything in Islamic context. Mythological imagination had to use the vehicle of religion to work things out, to write. You know, the religion was a vehicle for literary and mythological imagination, right? We no longer live we are now in a scientific age, and I'm willing to debate this later if I have to. But we live in a scientific age where we are in the world of science, psychologically, sociologically, biologically. We no longer need that. The whole text in my work, I have used the beloved, the almighty, the great one. You do not hear the word Allah or God in there because it does not belong there. It isn't even there. It's not necessary. I leave you with that. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Wonderful. We come to our final presenter, Dr. John Booker. Dr. Booker is a mythologist, storyteller, and writer based out of Hollywood, California. He serves as executive director of the Joseph Campbell Foundation, and very deserving of it. He is an author, podcaster, and speaker. He's worked with government and cultural leaders around the world as well as organizations such as HBO, DC Comics, the History Channel, Atlas Obscura. He has served as a producer, consultant, and writer for numerous film, television, and virtual reality projects, and is the author of 6 books, including the best-selling Storytelling for Virtual Reality, named by Book Authority as one of the best storytelling books of all time. It's available at the PRS bookstore. He holds a PhD in mythology and depth psychology from where else? Pacifica Graduate Institute. And he's spoken on 6 continents about using the power of story and myth to reframe how individuals, organizations, and nations believe and behave. I remember when Australia called John and said, "Can you come and help the Aborigines tell their story?" So in an uplifting, empowering way. He went. John holds a special place in my heart for his personal warmth, the warmth he brings to mythological studies, and his desire to heal the wounds of the world by healing its stories. When I asked him to tell us what Joseph Campbell had to say about an Iran in need of healing, he flew to her aid. Please welcome John Booker.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for hanging in there. What an incredible day this has been, am I right? Oh, just incredible. I have to apologize at the very beginning of my talk today. The divine did not bless me with the mother tongue of Persian. And so you're going to have to forgive my poor pronunciation of some of the words and the names and the terms that I'll be saying during this presentation. But I'd like to begin just by thanking Cross-Cultural Expressions, especially Mastane and Miriam. They've put this conference on, and they don't. We as the speakers get all this applause. Can we just thank them for this incredible conference? Long ago, in the times before these, Sadi was known to be a man that had everything. He had a beautiful palace, a wife that loved him very much, a son, a daughter. He had herds of cattle, he had silos of grain. He had ships at his disposal, and yet he felt as though he lacked something in his life. It was something important, something that disturbed his sleep and kept him up at night. Sadi wanted to know truth. Not just noble fables about right and wrong, not just wise sayings about the dangers of lies, not just simple thoughts that tickled his ears. He wanted truth. Truth in her rawest and most unveiled form. He wanted to know truth. So one day he shared this with his wife, and as he spoke, he began to become emotional. Sweat appeared on his brow, his voice raised, and he pounded his fists on the table as he earnestly and desperately described to her what he longed for. His wife looked into his eyes, and she could tell that he meant it. She could tell he was suffering. She could tell he had reached a point of no return in his journey. He wanted to know more than anything this truth. He needed it. So his wife had him put everything they owned in her name. She insisted on this, wise woman. And she sent him on his way to go and pursue truth. So Sadi left everything he knew. He left everything he knew. He said goodbye to his wife. He said goodbye to his children, his friends, and all the familiars that one tends to gain in a life. And the first night of his journey was very lonely. He sat by his campfire wondering if he had made a grand mistake. Anybody ever been there before when you've made a big decision to go out and pursue something? He thought about turning back. He thought perhaps there would be a better time to go pursue the truth. Maybe a season later in life when he was a little less busy. And with these thoughts, he drifted off to sleep, deciding to head back home in the morning. However, as often is the case, a good night's sleep can return us to our senses and give us a brand new perspective. And when he awoke the next day, Sadi, he felt his resolve stirred within him, and he decided to continue forth in his journey to find truth. So Sadi traveled day and night through rains and storms, through snow and sleet, through heat and humidity. He passed through green pastures, dry deserts, and one night he took shelter in a cloister of caves that overlooked a majestic valley. And while dreaming about all that he might be missing back at home, he was suddenly awakened by the poke of a sharp stick. He jolted upright and he rubbed his eyes. The shadow of a figure slowly came into focus. The moonlight crossed the face of the figure and a chill ran up his spine, and there she was, standing before him, wearing a tattered black cloak was truth. he had finally found her. Well, Truth was an old woman now, and her skin had wrinkled under the exposure of every known element and the touch of countless hands. She had no teeth left, and her long white hair hung down over her shoulders to her waist in matted, greasy strands. Her eyes still held the fire of the underworld and the glassy mystery of the seas. She told 𝗪𝗵 that she had been waiting for him in a low lyrical voice that sounded familiar, yet also like none he had ever heard before. Here she was in all her glory, truth, in all her filth, in all her unknowable timelessness, truth. 𝗪𝗵 spent a year and a day with Truth. He learned all that she had to say and all she had to instruct him about, and every lesson, every story, every hard-to-hear accusation that Truth had to say. And when the year and a day was up, 𝗪𝗵 stood before Truth, and he told her, "Madam Truth, you've allowed me so graciously to know you. You've taught me so much. And today, before I leave, I would be honored to do something for you. Is there anything in this universe that you wish?" Truth looked at 𝗪𝗵. She looked past 𝗪𝗵 into the skies beyond the cave. She moved her head to one side, and she pondered his question, considering what she might say. She played with the strands of her matted hair, and she began tying them into knots. Finally, she raised a bony finger in his face, and she said, "When you speak of me, tell them I am young and beautiful." And with this, 𝗪𝗵 returned home. There's a curious relationship between truth and poetry. Sometimes poetry helps us get at truth in ways that are just unachievable in any other way. Sometimes poetry helps us describe the ineffable. Sometimes poetry helps us get to those things which cannot be said with words. They can only be felt. For poetry is the mother tongue of love. When we hear poetry, it often feels as though we're remembering something that we've long forgotten, as opposed to hearing something that we've never heard before. There's also a curious relationship between poetry and Iranian myth. In the words of the poets, we find meaning in the mysteries. We find a glimpse of the shadows. We find the secrets of the psyche and the philosophies of the body. Through poetry, we are offered a pathway to a deeper experience of those stories, those characters, and those ideas that originated in ancient Iran. Western mythologist Joseph Campbell valued that poetic pathway into Iranian myth, and once he wrote this: "We have ourselves explored, even mapped all those distant lands today, but their magic somehow has vanished. For the marvel of the Asian Golden Age was that everywhere reality, fierce and difficult, though it was for all, as the records of history show, was translated not only in fable, but also in belief and experience into wonder. Which is, of course, as our own physicists now show, is exactly what reality is. The chief lost art of antiquity might be said, therefore, to have been living the art of reality to the sheer wonder of the world, passing readily back and forth between the plane of experience of its hard crust and the omnipresent depth of inexhaustible wonder within. The Persian poets wrote of this mystery in their figure of the cup and its wine, as in 𝗕𝗁, who wrote, 'Man is a cup, his soul the wine within. Flesh is a pipe, spirit, the voice within. Oh, 𝗕𝗵, have you fathomed what man is? A magic lantern with a light therein. Now, it's interesting that Campbell gravitates towards this particular passage that 𝗕𝗵 wrote. Of all the Iranian poets, of all the Iranian poems to explore this chief mystery, he chooses a stanza from the poet that includes two key symbols: the cup and the magic lantern. And of the many passages where Campbell discussed Iranian myth, history, its storytelling, it's with these two symbols that I would like to spend the rest of my time here with you this evening. Let's begin with the cup. Campbell had a great fascination with magical cups, and he spent a good deal of time exploring the Arthurian legends of Western Europe. And I greatly enjoyed the earlier presentation where we got to really dive into those Arthurian legends. I hope to add to that in my presentation. Particularly, Campbell was fascinated with those that dealt with what became known as the Holy Grail, which in the European myths, by the way, it begins as a platter. We don't have time to get into all that. Just suffice to say, eventually it becomes a cup in the European myths. Now, for Campbell, the mention of the cup by 𝗕𝗵 in this context is significant, as Campbell would have been well aware that his beloved Grail legends had their deepest roots in Persian mythology, with the cup of Jamshid, that we've heard a little bit already about today, the king. For those that might need a refresher about the cup, however, the cup of Jamshid had 7 rings and was said to have been discovered in Persepolis and had magical and protective qualities. Some poets and storytellers claim that the success of the entire Persian Empire was in no small part due to the possession of this artifact. The cup was said to be filled with the elixir of immortality. It was said to have been used in the ancient art of scrying. And in some translations, the cup is said to be a globe, which conjures up these images of like a crystal ball. 𝗪𝗏𝗪 said that it was common belief that all 7 heavens of the universe could be seen when looking into the cup. Some said the entire world was reflected in it, and that it had the power to draw the deepest truths for those that looked inside it. In fact, the heroic legend of Arslan, the cup, is visualized as a sort of crystal ball. So what does this presence of this mystic and mythic object tell us about Iranian mythos? In Sufi symbolism, the chalice and the wine of ecstasy play a role of primary importance, as you well know. 𝗵𝗆𝗆𝗵, he says, he was a 12th century Sufi master, and he wrote on this subject, and this is a translation of his writing by Lucian, and it says, "It should be understood that the knowledge of God is termed a chalice, and that this term is equivalent to the Persian, to the wine jar, the goblet, the cup. This chalice signifies the pure wine of divine gnosis, to whom it is granted, those few devotees who are the chosen, is a mystery of providence. The drinkers of this wine of gnosis may sometimes actually behold a cup in the formal sense, sometimes in a purely spiritual sense, and other times contemplate that cup only in terms of just the knowledge of it. This chalice of wine is granted purely through divine grace, for it is the grace of God granted to whomever he wills." Omar Khayyam later states in that same poem, "To find great Jamshid's world-reflecting bowl, I compassed the sea and the land, and viewed the whole. But when I asked the weary sage, I learned that the bowl was my own body and my soul." This points towards the wonder of the mystery within that Campbell pointed to and exemplified in the use of Khayyam's poem. But why a cup? Magic and wonder can take so many different forms: animals, wands, boxes. Why a cup? I would suggest to you this evening that the use of that cup in the poem and the reason that Campbell was so drawn to it had a much richer meaning in symbolism. I would suggest that the cup is the symbol of the feminine. Cups are shaped like and have symbolized the womb in a number of different traditions. Like the womb, it's the cup that receives the life-giving liquid to create new vessels for the expression of consciousness. But lest we also forget, the poem mentions a lantern. Why a lantern? Well, if the cup is the symbol of the feminine, perhaps the lantern is the symbol of the masculine. The shape of the lantern is almost always some sort of phallic-like geometry in its design, but aside from its shape, we see 4 symbolic masculine containments embodied in the magic lantern. First, we have fire, that we've heard a lot about today, a symbol that contained heat produced by the lamp. Next, the very phrase magic lantern states that there's magic involved, a symbol of the contained imagination. Then we have the practical function of the lantern, light, and in it we see symbolized the contained illumination. Finally, lanterns are never flat. They extend, usually in some way upward. They have reach, which I might suggest is a symbol of contained longing within the masculine. These symbols, the cup and the lamp and the coming together of the two, they combine in the poem to create a mythic image that was at the centerpiece of Joseph Campbell's chief interests in his later years, and that interest was love. For myself, and I believe for Campbell, Iranian myth is a poetic story of love. It's a love story, if you will. And I think we could all agree that the Persian poets understood love. Joseph Campbell gravitated towards these Iranian myths because he was deeply interested in the mythology of love. Regarding love, Campbell said, what happened in the 12th and 13th centuries when so many of these poems were being written was one of the most important mutations of human feeling and spiritual consciousness. That a new way of experiencing love came to expression at this time. In one of his talks, Campbell said that one of the most amazing images of love that he knew of was Persian in origin. A mystical Persian representation of Satan as the most loyal lover of God. You've heard the legend by now. When God created the angels, he commanded them to pay worship to no one but himself. But then, creating man, he commanded them to bow in reverence to this most noble of works, and Lucifer refused because we are told of his pride. However, according to the Persian version of the myth, it was rather because he loved and adored God so deeply and intensely that he could not bring himself to bow before anyone else. And it was for that he was flung into hell, condemned to exist there forever, apart from God's love. Now it has been said that of all the pains of hell, the worst is neither fire nor stench, but the deprivation forever of the sight of God. How infinitely painful, then, must the exile of this great lover be, who could not bring himself, even on God's own word, to bow before other beings. The Persian poets have asked, by what power is Satan sustained? And the answer that they have found is this: by his memory of the sound of God's voice when he said to Satan, "Be gone." What an image of that exquisite spiritual agony, which is at once the rapture and the anguish of love. Love is the burning point of life, and since all life is sorrowful, so is love. The stronger the love, the more the pain. Love itself is a pain, you might say. The pain of truly being alive. We sense that pain of love and experience of truly being alive in the words of Rumi. I love this particular translation that says, "The moment you left me, sweetness was stolen from my tongue. I turned to wax, burned like a candle, all night scorched by fire, no honey. No way to reach you, no way to touch your beauty. My body lies here in ruins, my soul a night owl." I would suggest today that the love story is the greatest metaphor of all for Iranian mythology. It's in the subtext of every one of the myths that we've heard today. I'd like to conclude my remarks this evening by engaging in an ancient practice of the poets, where the poet would speak their words over listeners as an invocation, as an admonishment, and as a blessing. And so I'd like to leave you with a few final thoughts about love from this poet Rumi, who knew a thing or two about the subject. In the ritual, if you'll humor me, and I know you've been setting a long time, so hopefully you will humor me, but in the ritual, those that the poet spoke the words over would stand to their feet. Would you join me in standing? These words of unity are about the coming together of people within a community, people that have had challenges and difficulties with others and with those that they love. Perhaps there's someone in this audience that you've had some challenges with. Perhaps there's someone in your community or someone in your own home you've had some challenges with. These are the words that Rumi left us with, and I speak these as a blessing over you. Let us love each other. Let us cherish each other before we lose each other. You'll long for me when I'm gone. You'll make a truce with me, so why put me on trial while I'm alive? Why adore the dead but battle the living? You'll kiss the headstone of my grave. Look, I'm lying here, still as a corpse, dead as a stone. Kiss my face now. May the words of the poet and the love that abounds in the characters and the motifs and in the stories found in Iranian mythology go with each of you as we go out today. Thank you very much.